Welcome to the Armory Show and to Armory Live and our second panel of the day, Architecture, Institutions and Climate Change. You'll notice that we've only got 3 speakers on stage with us. Unfortunately, Daniel was not able to join us at the last minute, but we have 3 wonderful speakers on stage and it's going to be a really interesting conversation. There'll be some time at the end for some questions. But until then, please put your hands together and welcome the 3 speakers on stage.
Thank you for having us. I guess we can each introduce ourselves, yeah? My name is Legacy Russell. I'm the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem.
I'm Jose Esparza Chong, and I work as Executive Director and Chief Curator at Storefront for Art and Architecture downtown here in New York.
And I'm Pedro Gadanho. I'm an architect, curator. I'm now a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University, but I've been working in the museum world also at the Museum of Modern Art, and then at this new museum in Lisbon called MAT, the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology. And I think I'm supposed to be the one kicking off the conversation, right?
Yeah, so I guess starting with the climate change expert over here.
Yeah. Supposedly because I am probably the most activistic here, and very proudly so. And this sort of activism and my involvement with this topic came precisely from an exhibition in the museum context in Lisbon. And it was one of the first projects I thought when I came back to start this new museum, which, as I said, was at the intersection of art, architecture, and technology. But also, we were wanting to produce a program that would be critical and, let's say, almost political, and would try from those disciplines to try and address current issues and look at work that's, of course, exists around us, from artists, from architects, etc., that are actually dealing with such issues. And for me, obviously, at that point, this was 2016 when I was coming back to Lisbon, climate change was becoming a more and more present topic, something you could not really go around. And I thought this could be one of the sort of manifesto shows that we could organize in the museum. Both manifesto in terms of this discussion of current issues, but also as involving artists and architects in dialogue with no frontiers, with no hierarchies. And so for 2 years, I researched, together with my colleagues, a number of practices that were already addressing climate change, or even more, as we went along, the climate crisis. And so we also wanted to make the project obviously impactful, and we thought it would be important to get a sort of coalition of different museums in Europe that would get on board on these projects. And in fact, it ended up being organized by 4 different museums in Sweden, in Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, which meant that the exhibition was not actually a touring exhibition, because that would go somehow against the grain of the ecological issues that we were trying to address. But it was an exhibition that appeared in each site with local content, with artists that related to the local constituencies. And so it was shaped by each of the institutions so as to address the magnitude of questions that come around in this question. And so for us, it was really about art and architecture. Others dwelled on new media, new technologies, indigenous practices, and so on. But we were really focusing on how art and architecture have been entering a dialogue to deal with these issues. So in the end, we presented about 40 artists and architects dealing with this issue. We had an exhibition that was initially started by the name you see there, Eco-Visionaries. It started on this positivist and optimistic vein by believing that we can find solutions for the problems we're facing. But then as I started to do my research, I became increasingly pessimistic. And so the exhibition ended up being quite schizophrenic in the sense that it alternated from ideas of disaster with the potential of coexistence with other species and climate justice, with then questions, obviously, of how designers are inventing a future that is already dealing with decarbonization and other important changes. And so the exhibition was really a sort of punch on the stomach, but by really picking on existing practices. I must say that at the time, I thought that I started to question myself if museums were still the realm in which this kind of exhibition could be actually held, just because of the fact that, the world of art sometimes seems to be verging too much on entertainment or on market-driven issues. Look at where we are. And obviously, I believe that museums could still be places, institutions where you could promote a debate, a public debate. And that was the starting point of such exhibition. But then I realized, and this was like open in 2018, 2 years ago, I realized at the time that people were even not yet prepared to receive such kind of content, and there was not so much media impact at the time. And you have to remember that this was before Greta Thunberg, the Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, which I think really changed the picture in 2 years. And so at that time, there was for me a little bit of a disappointment because the exhibition actually did not generate that sort of dialogue and debate and discussion that really it was intended to provoke. So it was not only about enjoying those works of art, and I'll talk about some in a minute, but it was really prompted to promote a discussion. And I think this crosses on other issues with which we're grappling nowadays. But for me, this became certainly one of the most important, just because I read more and I got to become more aware of the magnitude of problems that we might be facing. And so in that sense, obviously there were artists and there were architects that were already addressing these issues. In parallel to that main group exhibition, of which you see another section here, which would deal with the idea of mass extinction that might be derived from massive climate change. Other artists, we engage in a different sort of projects, which is the ones I really wanted to speak more about here, because I thought these could hold maybe more promise in terms of the ability of institutions, of art, of architecture, to really engage their viewers, their spectators, in terms of really understand some more issues than those that you get across the media every day. I mean, basically, you're always looking at this kind of information overload of data, of things that are happening, but you still feel a difficulty to relate and to create an empathy with those themes. And through art, I think sometimes that barrier can be breached and people can really effectively sense with their inner senses, with their bodies even, what is happening around them that may provoke serious imbalances in our ecosystems, in our ecological systems. And so one of the projects that we did on the side, because the museum has this large space, a 1,000 square meter space, in which we started these site-specific art projects. The first project we did that's clearly related with this theme was this installation by Japanese artist Tadashi Kawamata. And he normally works with urban debris that he picks up in cities to build these sculptures. Already since the late 80s that he's been working in that sense. But we challenged him to work with a material that was not so usual in his palette, which was really the plastics that are arriving at the beaches in Portugal, like in other places, and which brigades of activists have been collecting over time so as to try and clean those beaches. And so basically we worked with an activist brigade that was already doing that work, Over 3 months, they collected more than a ton of plastic garbage from just the beaches surrounding Lisbon. And then the artists selected some of the materials to create this big wave, which reminds you of some pictorial traditions of Japanese printmaking with these big tsunamis that are okuzami, these big tsunamis that are overwhelming human activity, to actually produce the reverse idea, which is this irony, this historical irony of the fact that now it's humans that are actually threatening the ocean. And so you would come from above in this installation. I didn't bring many images because our purpose here is to start a discussion. But you would come from above, you would see all the garbage like almost an ugly presence, and then you would enter from below, and you had this poetical sensation of being underwater with these silence and these shadows cast onto the floor that really provoked a very strong impression. And actually, this was, for me, the project that actually was much more successful. And schools started to come, young kids and so on, and there was much discussion about it. Television came, and that sort of finally provoked the discussion that we were aiming at. And so this is maybe one of the questions I leave to my partners here in the conversation, which is how can we actually expect that these impacts is achieved through our practices in the museums and in the art world. Another installation we did in parallel to that main project was by an artist that probably most of you know well, Tomás Araceno. And here again, we decided to curate this project. It was just before his big presentation at the Palais Tokyo. And we asked him to particularly work on themes that he was exploring of how could you imagine this future in which there would be these movements of people across the globe just using wind and solar power and not being prompted by fossil fuels. This was a research he was doing with these balloon structures. And so he sort of collected all the sculptures that he had done on that topic, and he created these environments, which was kind of an urbanism, a potential urbanism of the future. And again, that was something that stimulated the imagination and prompted you to address the topic from a very different point of view. And that's for us, maybe, again, what was important, to stir emotion and to stir imagination just from the work that was already being done by these artists. I would just quickly finish to say that, of course, when you do exhibitions, you're looking for that direct impact in your audiences, but they are also opportunity to do this research I was talking about and to promote thinking. And so the catalog for us was really the piece that remained, that's aggregated all the artists and architects that were present in the 4 exhibitions. And so that amounted to about 70 participants in the exhibition, but also new commissioned essays on the topic. And of course, those are objects that still are available that can eventually, hopefully, continue that discussion. But I would stop here to pass it to my colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll hop in to kind of contextualize a bit my own practice, but also recognizing that it does seem like the through line across all 3 of us are these questions about the ways where artists are maybe creating solutions, right, or offering opportunity to think differently about the world as a means of problem solving towards climate change, but also, I think, too structurally asking questions about how architecture and space can be decolonized. So in terms of my background, I am not an architect. I'm just going to come out and say it. And in terms of my work as tied to climate change, largely, my practice doesn't tie to that directly. I stepped into this panel through a different lens, recognizing that my background in research ties to the internet and performance. I work closely, obviously, with artists of color via the Studio Museum's mission, which supports artists of the African and Black diaspora. And through that, I think that I felt personally committed to the idea of questioning architecture, thinking about ways where bodies of color, queer bodies, female identifying bodies are traveling through space, but also to where maybe we are traveling through invisible space, or space that perhaps is not rendered within the physical, right, but is operating in the digital realm. And so for me, I think the kind of interesting questions to be asking about kind of systems here is largely thinking about this idea of a kind of digital future. The ways where, as you said, that movement, right, is going to be kind of an enduring question that's going to become more and more urgent over time, and ways where not only artists, but I think, architects and others who are kind of working within different types of materials are trying to think very critically and creatively about how to kind of overcome that as an issue, and ask about ways where we can kind of maintain our movement and be able to do that as a kind of right and liberty, right, even in the moments where the world is changing so rapidly that it's becoming ever apparent that that may not always be possible. So, I do think that these questions of kind of digital technologies, which is largely what my research is focused in and rooted in, is a geopolitical question. It's a question about, kind of time and space, and as well kind of mobility. And, these things definitely do a kind of a, very local level as we think of, for example, artist Zora J. Murph, who is a phenomenal photographer and has worked, doing a lot of work to kind of put a face to the ongoing histories of redlining across the United States. These are questions that are, very local and specific, but actually have a global resonance. We see them happening everywhere, and absolutely 100% tie back to these ideas of structures, systems, and as well climate change, recognizing often that the way that cities are mapped and how these things are structured do come down to race, class, and gender, and disproportionately spaces that have been impacted sort of adversely via climate change, or as well with the increase of certain type heating as well within different cities. The actual climate in space often does have a direct correlation to those who are living in that space who can be marginalized communities. So we ask these questions about things that maybe appear to be random, or maybe are at points rendered invisible by other kind of larger systems. But my primary point of interest here is to think critically about ways where artists are making those things known, and as well maybe offering up new directions and helping us better understand what that looks like.
So I think I maybe will take the conversation to a different place also, because I think that we were kind of put together, each of our practices are completely different, and the institutions that we work for are also
totally different.
Completely different. So as I mentioned, I work at an organization called Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is a very small organization downtown. It's at the corner of Kenmare and Lafayette. It has quite an interesting and unique history because it was founded by both artists and architects in 1982. So we're 38 years old, basically. And over the course of its history, it's had very direct engagement in issues about climate change. There was an early Kaumata exhibition in the early 90s. And there's been several exhibitions that tied very directly to that. But I guess that for us, we have very limited resources. We have a lot of energy and really kind of have been working very actively with artists to try to create their visions. It's an organization that works at the intersection of art and architecture, and that is very specifically focused in issues about the built environment. So within this kind of like much broader concept of the built environment, that we're actually trying to push this idea of architecture away from just the disciplinary kind of interests of architecture and think about it much more broadly within the built environment. I think there's many ways for us to think critically and creatively about how to address climate change. If perhaps our curatorial program doesn't necessarily address it as directly as eco-visionaries, for example. This is an issue that we think about consistently throughout our kind of daily practice. And this is because we have to do exhibitions with very, very limited resources. And this just makes us think very creatively about how we present the work that we want to, that the artists or the architects that we work with want to present at the gallery. So it's, I mean, if you think about it, these cultural institutions and these museums create a lot of waste. And this is something that I think that while these things can be presented in the program, it's also practices that I think that institutions have to assume and realize and make in their kind of like day-to-day kind of practice of working in these institutions. We just recently did an exhibition with an artist and an architect from Brazil, Carla Joaçaba, who's an architect from Rio, and Marcelo Cidade, who's an artist from Sao Paulo, where we did not purchase any material whatsoever. So basically, they just removed our. We have quite an iconic facade. If anybody knows Storefront, it's a commission. It's a permanent installation by Vito Conchi and Stephen Hall. It was commissioned in 1992, and it kind of opens up into the sidewalk. So it's all these like concrete panels that open up into the sidewalk, and it's composed of over 100 of these kind of like C panels. So basically this exhibition just removed the facade and hung it inside. So it was this kind of like critique of these kind of structures that are meant to speak about our built environment, but it was just this like really poetic reading of the vulnerability of architecture. And we had, for the course of 3 months, our exhibition was completely exposed with like the insulation panels and whatnot. But literally, we did not purchase any material. So it's an exhibition that for me is, while it doesn't necessarily have that kind of very direct agenda that it's about climate change and whatnot, it really spoke to that in a very indirect way. And it's just an institutional practice that for us, we're very aware of, and that we want to continue to be creative of how we do these exhibitions and how we produce them. I think that another thing that institutions should be thinking about is collaborating with other institutions to co-produce work. There's many times that museums collaborate and they each produce the same things in their different places without thinking creatively about how to really like have a less of an impact in the environment. And I think all of these issues are, from a small institution, we just like, there's no other way. We really have to be resourceful and think of how we produce. And I think that's a challenge for much bigger museums, and it's something that, because they have the resources to do it again, they just don't think about it. But I think I mean, art fairs, when like the last day of the art fair, if anybody stuck around for like when people are deinstalling and all the crates go up and all the waste that is amassed from 4 days of being here, it's quite obscene. So I think that this is something else that, while it's very important to have it in our curatorial programs, these missions and these agendas, but I think that we each have to take and assume the responsibility as cultural producers to think creatively about how we have less of an impact.
I think, too, just to quickly hop in, that it's useful to note, like, obviously, that we're in an art fair. I thank you for pointing that out, because I do feel like that the kind of maybe fetishized idea of climate change as an art object, right, like how that can be used as material, maybe is not our through line here, right? Like, the idea is to think towards ways where we can make an impact and ask questions about how that might happen. And even just, at a micro level, I agree with you thinking about the kind of materials and resources, like, with Maren Hassinger, who had a phenomenal commission last year for the Studio Museum called Monuments. She created these incredible structures that were built out of sticks, and inside there was dirt and compost that then over the course of the year further degraded and then was given to local community gardens. And I think that is like a simple action is actually really monumental and exciting to think about ways where, an artist can, at an individual level, really like do that work on behalf of communities that otherwise, might struggle with certain types of resources. And two, answering to a very real problem, right? Which is often that in spaces that, disproportionately, again, have people of color, or as well certain types of class barriers, that there is no green. So you'll see more concrete than you will actual trees. communities. And so recognizing that community gardens play an incredibly important role, of course, from a local level, asking about where you meet and congregate and can engage with this idea of a public space, but also, too, like really holding that green space, which is good for the environment.
And actually, I think that connects to some important practices that have been happening mainly in European museums, but here as well, in which these institutions are just addressing what is already being done by artists. So they're not necessarily directing or commissioning specific work that regards those issues, but actually are paying some attention to what artists spontaneously are producing as new forms of practice. And I think that is interesting both to advance the institution and the work of the artist, getting more visibility and at least also creating an opportunity to reflect critically on what they're doing. And so in that sense, I think it's that interaction between institutions and the artists and the players that are out there already addressing these issues. I think it's very relevant. I was also reminded by what Jose was saying of a sort of curious effect that the exhibition I mentioned had on the last venue where it appeared, the Royal Academy in London, in which actually the Royal Academy, for the first time, because it was organizing an exhibition that was specifically tackling the climate crisis, started to question its own practices as a museum. So the design of the exhibition was all made of recycled banners from previous exhibitions, and they, at the opening of the exhibition, actually had this pledge to start reducing their carbon footprint and so on. So the event actually made the institution reconsider their own position towards the subject. And I think that was probably one of the most fulfilling parts of that project.
And I think that also as art workers who care about these things, we have to also insist and demand the institutions and the people in our kind of networks to respond to these things also in a responsible, in a conscious way. We really have to work towards changing that mindset that like bigger and kind of flashier shows are good. There's ways of doing things with less resources. Financial resources, but also material resources. And I think that's something that working at a smaller organization has really made me very aware that you can do important and significant exhibitions that have an impact in the people that are connected to them without big budgets or a lot of materials and whatnot. We recently worked on an exhibition with an organization, a collective from Puerto Rico called Brigada Puerta de Tierra, which is Puerta de Tierra is a neighborhood in Puerto Rico that's been going under a lot of real estate speculation. And this brigade came together by cleaning abandoned buildings that were there, and they were, the idea was that they've been working towards establishing a museum of history and community of the neighborhood so that they aren't displaced by these new real estate developments. And they kind of saw the power of community. The exhibition was called Aquí vive gente, which translates to people live here, which is a slogan that they were using in Puerta de Tierra. So our invitation from Storefront was that they would for them to present somewhat the first public iteration of the museum that they want to establish in Puerto Rico. So we basically let them use our venue, and they changed our kind of institutional identity to their own institutional identity for the course of 3 months. And the exhibition was really just material, like it was just objects from neighbors from Puerto Rico that they brought in their suitcases. And they had an open call. There's a big Puerto Rican community in New York City, of course. Many of them are from this specific neighborhood. And over the course of the 3 months of the exhibition, people who live in New York were bringing objects, donating them to their museum collection. So this is just to say that there really is ways of making impactful shows that you don't necessarily have to produce big crates and do all these things. And it was a very important show for the people that we worked with.
I will complicate that a little further because I think I agree that like we sort of how we deal with resources is a big question in institutions. But I also think that sometimes, quite earnestly, we say, great, we're not going to do a printed publication, we'll put it online, or we're going to think differently about maybe how we kind of build out certain types of exhibitions by maybe using new medias and technology as the kind of answer for not having a material presence that can be wasteful. And I think that in itself often really gets under my skin, but also kind of makes me feel some kind of way a little bit in that, it does bring to light some big questions about really like what is green data and what does that even look like? And is it even possible at this stage in the world, given that oftentimes where our data is stored are, in kind of huge warehouses and outside of the United States, bringing up really big questions of labor, but also of power, right? Like these are like huge and monumental kind of inquiries. And, when we think about ways to kind of make spaces greener, the simple solution, I agree, is like aspects of kind of figuring out ways to re-resource or recycle, to exchange materials or use them differently, but also thinking too that I do feel like a kind of quick answer at points has been answering to this idea of technology as being the green bridge, and actually it's quite the contrary. So, institutions I think are really, up for a challenge to kind of figure out ways to re-envision what that can be, because of course it's complex and it is, as I said before, incredibly geopolitical, and even with technologies being present in many different places continues to be an access issue, where many people don't have access to these different things, and then as a result it becomes a question of where knowledge is stored, how it's being gatekept, and kind of how that maps out more broadly and kind of impacting how we see and engage with the world through visual culture.
And I think it's funny that we end up talking about resources, because resources is a critical theme for the climate crisis. It's all about resources. It's all about the fact that natural resources are dwindling, and we just keep on going like if we were, if they were endless. And I think that raises other issues, namely of climate justice, which I think is an important topic to raise here, which is, it's more and more present in the debate, the fact that, the effects of climate change are unequally distributed, and there are more vulnerable communities which will be affected by these. And how do you actually make that visible through the work of an art institution? And I think that's probably what you've been doing in a way, but I think it does connect back profoundly to the overall discussion, which is about our system and how it is so unequal. And actually, questions of inequality have been for me already important in previous work, and they sort of come back when you address the climate crisis, or the environmental crisis, if you want, which is really what is going on.
Should we open up for some questions? There are questions?
Hold on, I'm going to bring you a mic.
Oh, hey, thanks. So I'm thinking some ideas that might be inserted into this conversation. What might be inserted into this the conversation is the idea of an examination of what growth actually should be. Ever expanding use of materials. Growth might have a component that is the quality of life, rather than more and more and more and more. What's going on in small areas, and of course, again, included in that is the maldistribution of wealth.
Yeah. I can maybe address that because. There's actually been an important architecture triennial in Oslo last year, which precisely ended up questioning and exploring the theme of degrowth, which I think here is like taboo in the United States. It's something you cannot refer to. But degrowth is actually a movement that is considering those aspects. And I think precisely, I don't know so much in the field of art, but there are certainly artists that deal with capitalistic issues related to growth and degrowth. But in the architecture world, there's been many practices that precisely are focusing on recycling, on using available natural materials, renewable materials, and that was really ended up being the focus of that triennial. And that triennial, in a way, became a sort of the possibility to show a wide range of practices that are under the radar, that many people don't know, but actually are actively dealing with those issues. And I think those are the important questions in an overall context, and that depends on how institutions also manage to insert themselves into that discussion, right, politically.
Definitely. I mean, just to chime in from an art perspective, we currently have an exhibition on, even right now, at Studio Museum 127, which is our home away from home as we're building a new building uptown, of an artist, Dozie Kanu, who's Nigerian-American, and he uses only found objects. So like that has been, kind of a big part of like his creating different types of work that straddles the art and design world, and brings up these questions that are definitely, tied to the idea of architecture, right, which is like how to build and build sustainably, and as well seeing value in things that actually have been discarded by other people. I think too, we have at points with the sort of luxury and excess of the art world, an aversion to having that discussion, and I agree it can make some Americans quite uneasy. Not to shade my Americans, but I do, think that very much so it's an important thing to be talking about, and there are some really phenomenal artists just like Dozie who are young and thinking about this critically, which is exciting.
I mean, for me at Storefront, growth, or just speaking from the institution where I work in, it's a really small, we have a really small footprint. It's around a little bit less than 100 square meters. I don't know the translation into square foot, but I don't think growth would mean for us to have a bigger footprint, but rather be more institutionally healthier, to be able to do what we do. We basically operate through almost this like ecosystem of like friendships. Like artists stay at my apartment. Sometimes a friend who's not in town lets the artists that we work with stay at their apartment, and it really is this kind of like ecosystem, which I actually really, really enjoy. But at the same time, I think that it would be good for the institution to be able to pay better artist fees, and so that for me is growth, or that's the growth I would aspire to from our standpoint. Not necessarily have 3 floors, but have a better and more healthy and responsible way of working in what we do.
I'm not a professional in this, but I bring to this discussion as an educator a hope that instead of building more wonderful major architect museums in the Arabian Peninsula using migrant labor, not using them too well, et cetera, we could direct much, much more of our resources to education. You seem perfectly placed to do this, and I know some of you sound like you do it, but boy, would I like to see you take some of that money and step it up. Just get it up there and get it out to young people, and let's get some of these people with way too much money involved in this, because this is where it's at if we're going to make it.
I doubted that we really relate to that world of star architects and big production. I think we are precisely working on the edges, and where new practices emerge, and they may have actually a pedagogical role in showing people that there are different ways of doing things. And so I think it does relate, and I think it's very important. I've been thinking about a lot about that. The fact that architects themselves, they are also educators of society, of their clients, of people who commission buildings, and so they can bring agendas that are more important and positive and more valuable to the table. And so I do think education is part of it. But of course, in the more general context, it's through education that many of these issues will start producing some sort of change that I think we are talking about.
I mean, the Studio Museum, I'm sure as many of you know, was founded in 1968, right? And the people who founded it were philanthropists and activists, but in large part too, they were educators and artists. And so, you know, for that, our mission, even in building our new building, is to not build the new building so that it can take up maybe more space, but asking questions about ways where there can literally be room to kind of gather and to bring not only Harlem's community, but as well a kind of global community together to ask really important questions about ways where Black culture and artists of African descent can be centered within an art historical narrative, and as well pushing those discussions further to kind of ask questions too about the way that the world is changing. So absolutely, I mean, I think I agree that you're speaking to the right crowd for that.
And one thing is, just to clarify, I'm not against building. I think having infrastructure is very, very important. I guess I mean more just like having healthy and suitable infrastructure is what I would work towards.
Yeah, I think that ties back to this idea of like, you know, ways of compensating artists, right? Asking about what a sustainable future is, but also the redistribution of kind of wealth, right, across that, which feels really urgent. And I think that one way to do that, right, is figuring out a way to treat fairly the people who are producing and working and kind of, you know, giving their labor and time and space and their, you know, intellectual property, right, like in these different institutions and outside of them. That in itself is work that deserves to be compensated. And, you know, too often I think the mistake is that those things are undervalued. So it's useful too, as we think about sustainability, to note that that is kind of part of that wheel. Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly address your question because I think it's interesting that there's an architect, a Dutch architect, his name is Thomas Rauw. There's a great piece in The Guardian about him in which he's attempting to inventory all of the existing built materials in Copenhagen. And so he's there literally just trying to collect an inventory of all of the stuff that's built and figuring out how it might be able to be reused in the future. In the United States, the natural average for carbon distribution is 41% of the carbon is being created by built environments. In New York City, that's actually higher because we have so many built environments and the density. When I think about these things, oh, by the way, I'm a sustainability consultant for a living, and I help architects design and meet a lot of regulatory stances and think about how they might certify to become sustainable spaces. So I think about this idea and this concept quite a lot, and when I think about where we're heading or what we're working towards when we think about climate risk, the primary things that I'm pushing towards often are education. And it's not that people don't have the passion or want to do these things, it's that they're trying to figure out how to use their resources intelligently to do so and asking themselves what that actually means and what that looks like moving forward. Again, being in the state of New York, we also have CLCPA, which is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is a new act that came into effect last year. And I just bring that up to say that everybody in this room, if you live in New York, are thinking about the spaces, the interior spaces in this city. All of that's going to change in the next 20 years because we're the only state in the United States that have a regulatory requirement to do so. So I say all of that to say, when we're thinking about art and its impact, art can often be a little bit slow when we're in an environment where there's such urgency. And I see a change in that happening in real time in my life. I see a real change in that level of urgency. And I just wonder if somebody in this room or you could point out a moment or an artist or an artwork that attempts to address with some immediacy the concerns of climate change or climate risk.
I would love to. There actually is a phenomenal project called RAIR, which is based, RAIR, which is based in Philadelphia. And they literally run a residency out of a dump. And I bring it up because it is an incredible project. And Lucia, who's one of the founding members of RAIR, really did bring together an incredible group of people to think about how to do things, with limited resources, asking questions about waste and excess, and as well providing space for artists to think differently about what a residency is, right? Because I think that a residency too is like where they have all the great sandwiches and champagne, and where you can like paint and do all the decadent things, right? But then the other side of it is too that like those are also spaces and places, right, that are kind of part of this ongoing issue, right, and brings up some of those questions about resources. So thinking through a way to kind of push people to be out in the kind of plein air of that history, but not within like a beautiful decadent landscape with an incredible backdrop, but literally in a city that has a really complex relationship to industry. And that history, as part of its American history, being one that is troubled and continues to be unresolved, and brings up a lot of questions about race, class, and gender, and doing that work actively on the ground in a space that is, filled with waste. And so I do think like there are some great projects, but that's one that definitely comes to mind that deserves many shout outs, and I would encourage you to take a look and check out what they've been doing.
There's another practice based in London that works under the name of cooking sections, and they basically are trying to change food patterns through the research and exhibitions that they do. They're going to have an exhibition at Tate Britain in a few months where they're working very directly with the salmon, and they're removing salmon from all of the, I don't know if this is public already, but they're removing salmon from all of the menus from the Tate restaurants. They've been doing a lot of research in salmon and actually introducing shells because they clean the water, and they've been working on several kind of like multi-year projects that are connected to food. But I think that there's also other initiatives that institutions can take. For example, like the Serpentine Galleries has a curator of ecology, which is also specific. Lucia, whose specific role is to kind of like think about these things, do public programs around it, but also work in different ways with other nonprofits and NGOs around issues of the environment. And I think that other institutions that have the resources, such as Serpentine, could be doing things like that as well.
Yeah, and I think I can't be on the stage without having to mention decolonizing architecture, right, which is Eyal Weitzman and Alessandro Petti's collaboration, and that in itself, alongside of course, the successes of forensic architecture, these are kind of active examinations through the lens of research, right, that can be applied quite literally and very directly in lots of different places, even though often they have a very specific root.
Yeah, I think some good examples were added, and you could add some very important artists that you all know well that have been made a career out of those topics. But I do think you pinpointed something that is very right. I think at a certain moment there were artists doing research that was at the forehead of the discussion, just as scientists, and they were pointing to issues that were still under the radar. But I think reality is catching up so fast that actually I do think that at this moment I question, and this is the moment I'm living personally, I do question the ability of institutions to promote that sort of discussion. And this is why I actually stepped down from the museum and started a reflection on these, and now actually I'm lucky enough to have come across this fantastic possibility of creating a bid for a European Capital of Culture in Portugal, which I suggested would be at the intersection of culture and climate emergency. And therefore, this is much more than just culture. It's really, of course, using culture as well, but it's going back to action in the city, in the region, and bringing whatever is my curatorial experience more directly to tackle issues that are happening around us. And I think that might be one way. I mean, that's what I feel prompted to do. But in fact, I've done it because I felt that there was a limitation to what you could do. Although, of course, there is lots of fantastic work being done, especially in more independent institutions, because the others are very heavy, and until they get to the subject, it's gone. I mean, it takes 4 to 5, 6 years to prepare an exhibition at MoMA. By the time you're finished, the theme is gone. So, of course, agile, younger, more independent institutions will be more able to tackle those issues very quickly. And, but still, maybe, in fact, reality is catching up on us too fast.
Are there other questions? We've got maybe a minute left.
Hi. So I wanted to ask about one of the main things that I see connecting architecture, institutions, and climate change is the functional role of the money and power and where it's coming from within those institutions. So I mean, I know you guys, your institutions don't have the David H. Koch Plaza in front of them, and you're obviously operating in spaces that are more community-based, but how do you navigate these issues as far as, the very fact that we're at the Armory show, which exists to show amazing, great art, but also sell art to people with money, and that in and of itself is not a sustainable system. So I just wanted to ask your opinions about sort of the functional realities of climate change within the art world and how you've navigated those topics.
I'm going to start while you think. Just to say that actually I had this opportunity to create a new museum, and so I had the freedom, with certain compromises, to basically do whatever I needed to do. And that created an opportunity to actually do exhibitions that I think were relevant in that realm and others. But it was a corporate museum, it was a private museum. And I think as soon as the agenda was clear, they decided that maybe that was not the way they wanted to self-market, and therefore I came out. But there are opportunities, and there are moments in which these things collide, namely by philanthropy. I mean, I have known, and maybe she's around, Francesca von Habsburg. She's what I would call an activist collector. She's working precisely with artists that are tackling these issues, and she's promoting and supporting these artists to make new work. And that creates other possibilities. I think as sensibilities change and as the urgency grows, money will appear for those more ambitious projects. But I think in other contexts, it works pretty well also, as we've seen, without different resources.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up collecting, because that did kind of come to mind. And, I'm thinking of Peggy Cooper K-Fritz, who passed away and has been, a phenomenal, I would say, activist, philanthropist, somebody who supported Black art as a goal, right? Having to operate in commercial spaces, doing that work, right? But doing it with some questions about how that can be made sustainable, and really recognizing, too, that patronage sometimes it's like a one-way street, right? In that actually a certain type of giving does not require a return that's, kind of one for one. And I think that is kind of a complicated thing sometimes, right? Because people expect that they kind of are making a certain type of investment, and that gives them maybe a certain type of control, right? And or an opportunity to maybe get something back that's very concrete. So for me, thinking about like a more sustainable model of patronage, one that perhaps is more authentically tied to the kind of greater good, thinking about the fact that actually spaces like this, right, that have these certain paywalls, right, that require us to pay money to walk through the door, asking about whose right is it to see this material, right, and like asking too about the kind of more democratic nature that is what drives all of what we do, and thinking of through a creative lens. But I will say, kind of like on a personal lens too, working in spaces that are with some tie to the world. And I think that the art fair is a space that's going to have to do a lot of work to think about ways that it can continue to exist sustainably, because of the fact that it essentially has to kind of grow out of nothing and disappear all over the world on a regular basis, right? And so those are some really big questions, ones that we could talk about for hours about how that might be resolved. But I recognizing that an institution that invests in a certain type of longevity, right, permanence there, even if in the future maybe there will be no museums, right, is in itself a kind of certain type of giving. And that in itself, for me, on a personal level, is meaningful.
I think that's all we've got time for this afternoon, so please, can I thank again Pedro, Jose, and Legacy for their wonderful conversation.